Okay, this week, instead of saying, can you introduce yourself for the audience, this is going to be something a little bit different. And it's basically going to be talking to each other, but mainly I want to revisit a conversation with Richard, because it's how this podcast got established would be a nice way to discuss where we are with the podcast and how we got to where we are in this lovely series of interviews. So yeah, I'm here with Richard. Thank you for joining me for the meeting.
My pleasure, Simon. And like you say, this is how it all started. The idea for Painting Insights podcast is Simon interviewed me on his channel, Good Values podcast, which is on YouTube, and we got talking, and Simon interviewed me. I think it was the first podcast. Yeah, it was the first podcast interview I'd had. And I was used to working on Zoom, teaching on Zoom. But we had a really good interview, and then talking at the end, said, would you be interested in doing a podcast focused on painting and talking to painters? And the main reason for that was, in a way, because many artists, including myself, spend a lot of time in the studio, and we're often looking for things to listen to. And I listen to all kinds of things, from true crime podcasts to football to music to whatever it is. I do listen to some art podcasts, but I always felt that there was a little bit of a gap in the market. Talking to painters about what it means to be a painter, and sometimes the grand ideas that they have, the philosophy that underpins their practice, but also the little things. How do you go about the day? How do you set up your studio, your colours? How do you deal with creative block? All these types of things. And I remember when I was really starting to take painting seriously, I would try and look for this information online or in books. And for me, it really was the basic things that were most important to me. So when I look on Instagram or on someone's website or see their work in a gallery, we see the finished piece. Sometimes we see the workings, we see the finished piece. But I know as a painter that it doesn't arrive just like that. There are many things that go into it. And often what happens is, and I have this kind of vision or view or bias sometimes, that we look at a professional painter and we see that their talent is obvious, but that talent is often a struggle. And there are many frustrations that go into having that final work that goes up on their Instagram page or on a gallery wall. So really, my inspiration for this podcast was to get behind that a little bit and to find out a little bit more about what makes artists tick, but also what ticks them off as well and gets them frustrated. Yeah. So Simon and I talked, and that's how the podcast was born.
Yeah, no, I'm very appreciative. It's really interesting because, like you said, you look at the artwork and you know that it's taken a series of very complex decisions which you have to make in order to find a balance, correct mistakes or hide mistakes, or push past an uncomfortable middle point in a painting. And things like that aren't things you can see when you're looking at the final product or preliminary sketches. So to try to extract some information from artists is something which I think is invaluable. Recently, I was sent an episode of a podcast from a friend, and a female artist who I've stayed friends with for quite a while now. And she sent me this episode because they talk about education. She knows that I've got a difficult education background, really, as far as wrestling with different philosophies that you can find in schools to what aligns with your own. And the podcast that she sent me, the first half wasn't about art. It was about the person's background and where they lived and how the interviewer knew the artist. And because it wasn't about art and I wasn't familiar with the artist or the interviewer, it was difficult. And it's only because I was drawing and really had a long time to kind of listen to it without needing to change it. Otherwise, I would have skipped. The second half of the podcast was fantastic because it was a bit of knowledge and a bit of shared information. It's one of the things I think is really valuable about what you've brought to my to this collaboration for me, is that it gets straight into the meat of being an artist, and that's what I find really interesting. And it's really helped me evolve how I speak to people and how I understand the experience of the interview and conversation on a podcast. Really developed. I was just revisiting today my first conversation with you, and it's quite different to how I would approach an interview now. Obviously, I'm not formally interviewing you like I was initially, but if I were, I would be a lot more considerate with how I approached a question than how blunt and kind of terse the question was back then. I'd say, what does art mean to you? And that was the question, giving you no time to actually process anything, and watching you discuss topics with artists made me appreciate how much space you gave them to actually get into the right frame of mind to answer a question. And that's really, I really just appreciate the experience. It's a real privilege to sit in on the conversations, really. So that's great.
And I think as well that this journey on the podcast is interesting because I'd never interviewed anybody before and was quite nervous about it. But I thought just talk as if you were talking to a fellow artist in a pub or at their studio or something like that. And I guess it's that curiosity, like your curiosity, to do your podcast, to talk to artists, to find out what it is that they do, how they think. And, that in many ways is a podcast about conversations, and not necessarily just hard interviews, because we can know about the artist's work by looking on their website, following them on Instagram and stuff. But that's, like I was saying earlier, that's just the surface element of it. So that curiosity about finding out more and having those kind of leading questions in a way, or when I ask a question and I notice it, I tend to sort of do a preamble, sometimes 5 minutes before, and then ask the question. But it's that curiosity, and it's that seeing whether people's knowledge kind of aligns. It's like, I experience this. Do you feel the same? Does the same kind of thing happen to you?
Yeah. I mean, it really was a shit. It was very fortuitous for me because of meeting you on my first podcast. Well, not my first, but technically I had a first podcast during uni. That ended in a certain way. And then I started interviewing people because of how my first podcast ended. I spoke to a friend on Instagram and she did me the favor of saying, I'll be a guest and I'll get you another guest and we'll just see if we can figure out how you can, start, because I was working with a co-host on my first podcast. So my second one was starting from scratch. And I just thought, I don't want to stop podcasting all of a sudden. I want to keep going because it's a nice contribution to the online discourse, I think. And to give something positive and creative is something which I think I'd appreciate if I, were someone else. And the first season was mainly people who I knew, or people who knew someone who I knew, so it was a favor of a favor. And then the second season was people who I didn't know, and you were in the second group. And I was reaching out to people on Instagram, mostly illustrators. And because I mainly illustrate, which I'm trying to do 50-50 lately, and it's not been happening, but that's my ongoing aspiration, really. But there were more illustrators, and then towards the end, I had Tim Benson, and then I had you as two painters, just in 24 episodes, two painters. And I was a little nervous with both of you because I thought, I'm so used to talking to illustrators, it's such a shared language, that I don't have as much experience with painting. And I felt I'd be out of my depth. And as much as I know your work and I'm a fan of your work, I didn't know how the episode would go, so I was a little nervous. And I remember talking on the phone to someone saying, I don't know what I'm going to do. I know that he works with palette knives. I'm really curious about certain aspects of palette knife works. I don't know much of that. And then afterwards calling them saying it was amazing. It was an amazing conversation. I could have spoken to him for another hour. And they were really happy for me, saying, that's great. I'm glad I knew it would go well. And it was just happenstance, really, to have that opportunity for you to take me up on my offer of being a guest. Because a lot of people either don't because I'm still establishing myself, or because, they may be shy on camera or whatever it is that makes some people hesitant. So that was something which has changed the trajectory of my latter part of my year, and hopefully the years to come, because I really enjoy this format and the opportunities to listen in to two professional working painters discussing different facets of their daily life and yearly kind of struggles of putting out work, exhibits and sales and all types of different sides of it. Yeah,
the whole spectrum. I think as well with it, I mean, I've always been someone who has been happy articulating the ideas behind my work and how that links in a way to art history, to contemporary practices, to other painters. And it is, I mean, I know there's many artists who would be happy to talk. It's those who aren't necessarily happy to talk because they let their work talk for them. That's the main form of expression. But I think I found when we had that interview, you made me feel relaxed and you gave me that space to kind of talk. And it's funny looking back at it now and just seeing some of my mannerisms in it as well. It's not that long ago, but I can see how I've got more used to sort of speaking within this context, whereas before I was more used to writing about it. But I think it's a good thing, and this goes to our reasons for doing it is to try to open up a discourse, a conversation around art and around painting that is adjacent to, connected to, and very much a holistic part of what we see visually with social media nowadays. Say with captions and comments on posts, I'm often surprised by how many people engage in them with me. Often I've got nothing to say, so I'll just put the painting title on there. But sometimes I'll write something a bit more, mindful in a sense. And I'm always surprised that people actually read them and engage. And whether it's an interest in how the painter is thinking, or curiosity, whatever it is, it just gives that other dimension. And I think, and I realise that I do this too. So it's me surprised that people reading my captions, but I'm going and reading other people's, because the painters who I admire and look up to, again, it goes back to that thing, that looking for those bits of information around them as artists, not just the finished product.
Mm.
So this podcast, in a way, is to give a long form version of that caption, and to have it on as, whether it's a professional painter, someone who's just interested in art, or someone who's learning. Whilst you're painting, you can have this on in the background,
Mm.
and it sort of enrich you in that sense, to see that, you know, they're all painters, they're all artists, but they're all so different in how they approach things. There's commonalities, but there are also differences and distinctions.
Yeah. With one outlier, I was recently grateful to have Ralph Sanders as a guest,
Yeah,
who's not a
yeah,
painter or an
absolutely.
artist, but
Yeah,
a lovely interviewee.
yeah. And I have to say, yeah, and I said this to Simon, that on our Apple and Spotify and, you know, all of the podcast thing, the interview with Ralph is the biggest download, so it's got the most amount of downloads,
Yeah.
which is really encouraging, because it shows that, you know, people are interested again in, you know, how these things work. You know, these galleries that seem like, you know, they're kind of opaque from the outside, and artists are both excited and daunted by galleries, and so it's really nice to get that insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd like to ask you, if I could, about your experience with the podcast a little bit. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am interested to know, because we've interviewed so many artists, has anything kind of surprised you where you were anticipating? I mean, I don't mean as though that doesn't seem like a logical answer. I just mean, you know, when we're talking to artists all the time, have you had anything where you think this has really revealed something that I hadn't anticipated, or it's basically brought something to light that I wouldn't have really considered until the experience of recording all these episodes?
Um, not really. I think what it has done in a way is again, we see these artists, which maybe see a snapshot of them in their studio here and there, but you see the person, you know, the person behind it, and that's what I've found with the interviewing. And you know, some of these artists I've followed and admired, like, way before I was a professional artist. You know, it's like, so to kind of meet them in that sense, and to talk to them, is quite an honour and a privilege. You know? And,
Yeah.
you know, so it's that kind of building connections and a community that has really sort of helped me and inspired me, but also to know, and you know, some artists opened up more about this than others, that, you know, there are these universal kind of struggles in being an artist, whether it is, you know, from that business point of view. You know, nowadays we have to be kind of very business savvy about what we do, or it's about things like finding a style.
Mm.
You know, many people think when they see my work that I just sort of landed upon this style, how I paint. It's taken many years, and it all happened very quickly. So, you know, I've got boxes and boxes of paintings over there which are rejects, you know, and it took years and years just to sort of experiment and make rubbish painting, to then suddenly click and make a style. Now, to understand that most artists actually sort of go through that process themselves, and there are a few. I'm just thinking of Sonia here. when we were talking to her, she was saying that she was in the city making geometric abstractions. Now, I used to do something similar, but then because of COVID and, you know, being in the city and not seeing the sky so much, did that become important, and how she then fused that with some of the training that she got from her mum. And, you know, sometimes all of these things click into place. For other people, it's been a much more linear process of going to art school, of developing style through, you know, training and all. So this is what's fascinated me, that even I, you know, who people think that my style has just sort of happened, I look at those other artists and just think, wow, you know, they immediately just started painting like that. But that's not the case. So that's been the biggest insight for me, is to learn about painters' journeys, really.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I mean, as I was asking the question, I was thinking I should really consider what, because there are a few things which, there was an artist who, I think there was a couple who don't use sketchbooks, and to me, it's just, it's not a, you know, should or shouldn't question. It's more trying to conceive of being a professional working artist and never having to do that, because you think it's kind of built into the structure, but it's not always the case that someone will work things out on the canvas. But it's kind of, then there are people who say that they're self-taught and they'll impose this structure on their own, you know, off their own back. And that's what always impresses me, is how people will make their own kind of patterns of, this is how the workday, you know, is built. And I've really appreciated that, the how prolific certain people are. I tell you one thing which really surprised me, and this is a small thing in a way, but I've spoken to people in galleries when I've been having exhibitions this year about this person. It's Rod Major, who, he was the way that he would film his own painting, because he's an older gentleman and he's much better at doing that than I am. When I've either been plein air painting, I'll set up a camera, I'll paint, I'll stress out about it and try and work it out, and then the battery will run out. I'll either change the battery until that one's dead, or I'm done, and I just need to paint the rest and keep bits on my phone. But he's constantly doing vertical pictures as well as having horizontal images, and it's just such an adaptation for someone of his vintage to be able to know that this is for reels, this is for the square format of Instagram, and then he'll have his horizontal images for whatever video, if he wants it for YouTube or any other platform. He just has great coverage of his own work, and that really surprised and impressed me. I thought that older artists would be understandably set in their ways, where technology would be an inconvenience and would hinder the process. And he just seemed so comfortable with it that I was very impressed by that. Yeah, that really.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because I mean, social media can't be ignored now. I think we've talked to every artist about it, especially Instagram. You know, and I've said this before. I think, you know, Instagram was the facilitator of my success. And a lot of people moan about Instagram, and I have my moments of moaning about it. But really, I mean, it's such a great tool. But you see now with all of these painters that we adapt how to use these tools for marketing. I saw a great post actually on Threads the other day. I should have screenshotted it, but I didn't. But it was someone saying, you know, artists quit moaning about Instagram and how this or how that's not happening. Before it was probably harder. You would have to go around with your portfolio to this place, to that place. You know, you would have to basically print off things to send to galleries. You'd probably have to, especially if you lived in a rural location, travel to cities to visit galleries. in many ways, artists nowadays are, in the most privileged position ever.
Mm.
Before, in relation to galleries, very few artists would get represented by galleries in the past. There aren't that many galleries in this country, or in Great Britain. To get yourself represented by a gallery, you've had to go to the right art school, have the right contacts, or be discovered somehow. But nowadays, artists have all of these tools to hand. Learning how to use them is not that hard, but it needs that hunger, and it needs that same type of creativity you put into your work to be put into the marketing of your work. Because again, you would have had to have done it in the past, but it would have been much more labour involved in it. So with everybody we've talked to, that element has been really strong. And on the podcast, we kind of sort of said that we use kind of someone's Instagram ranking in a way nowadays, as a categorizer of whether they're suitable for an interview. It doesn't mean that, that they're anybody beneath a certain amount is a bad artist or not worthy. But we're both aware in this of the marketing elements for our own podcast, that we want to be able for this to grow. So we need to tap into also people that do have that platform. So seeing that and seeing how artists have adapted and done it in their own ways, there isn't one single way of doing it. And whether they're plein air painters like Rod, who's on location and who's able to capture that process of his painting in development in the final piece. Or going back to Sonia, that she's able to do these gold leaf paintings, but actually show parts of that very technical process. And Linda Mann as well, who makes her reels. I mean, her paintings take 6 months to create. So how she works around that for creating content for social media, it's really, really important and creative and fun as well. So yeah, that's been a real interesting insight, because again, we just see the surface. We see the painting that's posted on Instagram or the reel. I can tell you behind those, there is a lot of both frustration and coming up with ideas to basically help get one's art out.
Yeah. Well, we actually had that. I think it may have been Linda. I know my brother does this when there's some kind of promotional filming that's happening. You're so in the moment painting that they may have missed that moment. So you just have to have either a dry brush, or with my brother, he uses spray paint because he does murals, and he will just kind of, go over the same point again with the same color, because he's like, you've missed it, you missed the point. So if you want to get the photograph, we're going to have to do it from me just pretending to paint the wall, because it's difficult if you're that type of artist who's too engrossed with the piece to say, now I set up a camera and I work around a camera. It's sadly built into my process now, where I have a camera that's, the pole is there and I reach my arm around it and I'm looking at the other side of the pole. So it's basically, for anyone listening, it's center in my head. Basically, it's right in front of me to look down at the desk where I work. That's hopefully going to change in the future. But yeah, what you were saying about trying to build up the platform is something which we've talked about and is a more well considered model than my initial podcast, which I want conversations to be seen by as many people as possible because I see the value in them as someone who relied on podcasts a decade ago when I came back to Wales. It was 2014, and I remember sitting in the living room or on the floor trying to do sign writing and trying to paint. And I was just starting out, and I was using art podcasts as a way of trying to educate myself before I tried university to think, what have people struggled with? What has their success been? What are their thoughts? What are their, kind of roots through the industry or the landscape, as it were, to try and find a way to make a living as an artist, because that's very difficult. And that's something which, in a way, I'm trying to do, but in another way, I'm just trying to make sure that it's a creative kind of business that I'm in, really. It doesn't necessarily have to be my art that makes me money because I'm not really there yet. But I feel as though there are things which are professional practices that I'm engaged with. So aside from, doing the work and trying to build up the platform and the name and establish it, we have discussed and started filming for additional members of a Patreon channel. And that's something which is already underway. It's not got a video up yet, but by the time this gets posted, it may have, because that's an additional part of the podcast channel that we are excited to offer and to develop, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with it as well, to help it continue and develop like that, like Simon says, the more people that get to hear these podcasts, the better. I mean, we both get loads of enjoyment out of this, and I think for me, it gives me that respite from my own myopic kind of art practice, to talk to other people. But heading into 2024, what we're looking to do is really just keep these coming. There are no end of artists to interview. We're also going to try and have some panel discussions, so we could bring on say still life painters to talk about the difference and their different approaches. And so in regards to Patreon, basically Patreon will help us keep going in that sense, and for us to be able to create better content and have more people on there. So do watch this space, because we will be in early 2024 putting a Patreon out there, and would appreciate your support with it. But our mission really is to create this podcast as sort of mind food for artists, whether you're amateur, professional, or just interested in how artists tick and what they do all day. So that's the thing, and we're looking to build in 2024. Hopefully, try and get some sponsorship on board as well, maybe from art manufacturers along those lines. What we don't want to be doing is advertising memory foam mattresses or anything like that. So Patreon for us is much more wholesome, and I would say it's got more integrity for us for what we want to do. This is for artists. So yeah. So watch this space anyway, and we will be filming and recording exclusive Patreon content.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a few things I'm looking forward to next year, and I'll mention let me think of the three three things I think I'm looking forward to, especially next year, and that is one would be getting some abstract artists on the channel, because that's something which we're constantly reaching out to artists. And I remember telling Richard that when we first started, I had a rule of thumb when I'm reaching out to artists, which is every 10 offers that I make to people to come on the podcast, I'll usually have one response. So it can be a difficult ratio to negotiate. So I'm hoping that when I connect with an abstract artist, I'm looking forward to that conversation, because that's something which will be, I think, quite insightful in ways which maybe haven't been covered yet. Maybe I can imagine there'll be lots of overlap. That's also part of the fun. The other thing that I'm looking forward to is more maybe galleries or curators or frame maker. Just kind of, don't get me wrong, I love painters, but because the painting industry has different levels to it. One of the things you mentioned when we first discussed this idea was to have artists and frame makers and curators and gallery owners, which is something which really excited me, because I can't think of another podcast that focuses solely on those things. So that's really, I don't know, I think that should be a goal for next year, and that's something I'm keen to try to make happen. And the third thing, which I know I'm going to make happen, is to come and meet you in person and to have an episode where we're sat with each other in the room chatting, because that's something I was hoping to do this year and it just wasn't feasible for whatever reasons. So next year I
And you
can't
see,
wait.
I'm not just a torso on the screen.
Yeah, same here. I think there'll be kind of a height check as far as like how tall are we? That'll be interesting. So yeah, I'm
Cool.
excited for those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Mm.
So we're doing this episode really to talk, just reflect on what we've done with the podcast, and to talk about art and ourselves, and to just sort of revisit our initial interview. And it's interesting when you get to know someone over time. Simon and I have never actually met, which is really interesting. It shows something about our virtual world nowadays. We do meet each other in these ways, and it's a very a valid way of meeting. I remember during the pandemic, even now, I'm sort of I work with a charity in London, and I provide wellbeing workshops for them. And a lot of the people I knew before the pandemic, but I've long left London and moved to the countryside. But some of them I've never met, but I feel like I know them almost just as well as the people who I did know, like IRL,
Yeah.
that and art, in that sense is such a sort of a global thing now. I mean, I teach for Penn School of Art, which is based in America, and soon Ohio Art Center as well. Things like Zoom, but Instagram and painting is such a universal thing, and I never thought that, even a few years ago, that the majority of my work would be selling in America, and I'd have this sort of connection to the US just through my work, and how that has just opened up so much. It's fascinating, and that's what it means to be an artist in the 21st century, and in a digital world, and in many ways in a post-COVID world as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, for my post-COVID experience, this has been the most positive and kind of the most potential that is bubbling away and making me excited for the future is this podcast and what it offers as far as creating this amazing network of people who want to share their experience. It may sound strange, but a couple of decades ago, I used to be a skateboarder, and no matter where I'd be in the world, if there were a skate park or kids with the skateboards, I'd be able to go up and I'd have community. And I found the same thing with art because I wasn't an artist back then. But when I started making art, it's the same thing when I see anyone painting or drawing on the street, or if I'm drawing or anything, you'll find we're attracted to each other in the way of wanting to connect and to discuss things, and you find community there. And it's just this lovely, as I said earlier, shared language, really, where you use the same terms to describe certain things which other industries maybe don't, or other parts of life won't, know how that's, described or why it'd be called that. And it's a nice shared experience, and
Absolutely.
it's comfort, isn't it?
It really is. And it's also attached to this great history as well. I say something on my website, about. I'm just going to bring it up here, just to sort of demonstrate that connection. So just
my fourth goal for next year is to make my own website.
Yes, yeah. I think it's good because it helps you. It helps you sort of, you can survey yourself on the outside by doing it. So I've said on here, just in a little artist statement, that I'm primarily an expressive landscape painter working in the English Romantic tradition. I should say European Romantic tradition, really. I feel a deep connection to the landscape and the artists who who also chose the sky, sea, and land as their source of inspiration. Turner, Constable, Sego, Daubigny, and Courbet. The gaps of generations and hundreds of years matter little, regardless of what has changed in this world, the technological advancements and societal shifts. The landscape is always there as something eternal, the ever-changing muse, always present, yet never the same. So what I'm saying is that I'm kind of sort of, they're my peers in a sense, even though they're, the generations and generations before. And I think the more one gets into art, it's that whole community of your contemporaries who's practicing now. And again, that's what we're doing through these podcasts. But then all of those strands within the historical context of it, that it's just a fascinating thing. And to be working within a tradition and to be borrowing from that, and then you see another artist you admire, and then they're referencing this artist, or some of them I've never heard of because it's a very different painting style. But it kind of connects us both now, in the past, but also in the future, by helping to disseminate this information and to create work that does then influence, future artists. Or it just amazes me. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I must admit, there's someone who I used to refer to as a mentor. Now I refer to her as a friend, because she doesn't love the term mentor as much as I will attribute, my artistic growth to her assistance. But and when I talk to her about this podcast, she always says this is the best education you could possibly ask for. And because I have the privilege of sitting in, but also I edit the podcast, so therefore anyone who refers to an artist, I look them up, and it'll be a cursory bit of research. It won't be, a deep dive, but it's familiarizing myself with names, with eras, and with movements. And then we also have this amazing feature of people's color palettes, which is another part of my education, to see the hue difference, to hear the explanation, how the palette develops, how it lends to each other, and the transparencies and the varnishes and different things, which are considerations of different types of painting, which until you experience it, you don't have that first-hand knowledge. But before experiencing it, you can glean insights from the podcast, which is why it's so aptly named, and it has that just beautiful essence of kind of truth underlying all of it, because artists want to share their experience. There's no gatekeeping for this kind of conversation, and I love it. I think it's just
Yeah.
fantastic, really nice.
And like you were saying with it, I mean, a lot of artists say, well, I don't know what I'm going to talk about,
Mm,
but I know myself from this, you start asking an artist about which colors they use, and you know, they're happy to talk about it because it's very much a personal thing, and it's often quite a private thing because being an artist is in many ways a solitary pursuit.
mm,
You know, there are artists um, like Tushar and, you know, with the plein air groups who will go out together and, you know, have that kind of um, more community based experience with painting. I tend to be the opposite. I'm a solitary artist, and all of these little things. Maybe I'm not, because I go and I teach painting, so people, you know, are asking me these questions about the colours, you know, all of that kind of stuff, and in many ways that's my respite from the solitude. But you know, each artist has, through experimentation, through trial and error, through, like myself, buying every colour possible, to then sort of come down to a few colours that I use. These are like such important things to be able to share and for people to learn from.
mm,
I remember buying or borrowing from the library or going in whatever shop and flicking through, you know, all of these artist manuals and books, you know, the essentials of oil painting, and it's pretty much the same information in all of them,
mm,
and you can never really get a grasp of it for some reason. There are books that have helped people along the way,
mm,
but you know, to me, I never really got it. But from being down in Cornwall, when I first started to get really interested in painting, I was at art college at the time, meeting two professional artists, very well established in their career, and being in the same studio complex building as them, and then just welcoming me casually into their studios, seeing how the paints were laid out, seeing how things were stored. I learned more from that than I ever did, first of all, on my degree course. Second of all, from any books. So by having artists talk about this, and yes, we're not in the studio with them, but it's like gold dust in many ways. So it is for me, you know, and it was for me. So I try to, through teaching, whether they're weekly classes like I do, or online, or through this podcast, or any questions people ask me on my website or Instagram, is to give those little gems of information, not this whole view that a book may give you, but
mm,
someone might want to know, what colour did you use up in that cloud?
mm.
I can tell them that, and that can then unlock something for them.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, it's
No, I agree.
that sharing.
You have to try these things to find out how it works. I suppose I've got a weird philosophy. I think it's since I used to go to a lot of life drawing classes, far less these days, but I used to go to so many all over the country. And one that I went to quite often it would be old people, but some would be very good artists, some would be, less good. And when I'd sit next to ones who weren't as good, they were still amazing company, lovely, so funny to sit next to. But I'd sit next to them and I'd be in this same class for, say, a year every week. sit next to them, and they wouldn't get any better. And I thought practice is essential, but it can't be the only, you need more than just practice, because this person showed up every time on time, did the drawings, filled the page with tone, and fell short every week. Now, I love this person, and they would ask me for help, and I'd try to. One time I just said, can I draw on top of your drawing to show you the decisions that I'd make differently? Because I thought I want them to push through this blockage, and it's sometimes harder to describe. And I want to just show them what I would do differently so that they can do the same thing. And I even introduced them to different pencils and just trying to do anything to try and break this habit. But it's a mindset of maybe a lack of, self-critique or whatever it is to kind of stunt your growth. And I'm very grateful to not have that, that kind of limitation in a way. But I do need the conversation. I need the theory. And it's not all theory, but I do think it's a blend of the two, because without some ideas to introduce to your own habits, I don't think you'll necessarily always experiment and discover. I think for you experiment more. You talk about that when I interviewed you. With not everyone, never every artist does that. What are your thoughts on that anyway? Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, again, everybody's got their own approach and on their own journey. I mean, I've never ever been to a painting workshop or done a course in painting. I mean, I've got a degree in fine art, but believe me, they don't teach you any painting on that degree. I am a big believer in experimentation and just keep trying different things. What will happen is that you will usually fail each time at those different things, but over time, things that did kind of work start gelling together. From teaching, and I'll explain, how I teach. So I'll come in with a different thing each time. So sometimes I'll bring in some photographs of some Constable oil sketches. Right, so we're going to look at Constable today, how he's doing these. Other times I'll just draw basic kind of thumbnail sketches on him. Right, we're going to do this, or get some photographs and say, right, you can look at this photograph for 2 minutes and then turn it off. Switch the palette around. So sometimes it's just 3 colors, sometimes it's 4, sometimes I say just a brush, sometimes just a palette. So I'm constantly switching this thing around. What I'm trying to do is get people to break out of habits. So I think it's important to take those risks and keep doing it over and over and over. If you're sort of doing the same thing each time and not getting any, say, better or being able to break through those things, that's where you need to do something radically different. Normally what creates that radical difference for me is creative block, where I'm like, I can't do what I can normally do. So I think I've got to do something completely different, and that's what I do. But I think this is where, either as an artist or as an artist working with a teacher or mentor or an artist friend or whatever, is that in your practice, you will get to points where there is let's think of a landscape, that there is a swollen river to traverse. You've been going along just fine and you hit this river. How do you get over that? So, there are a few ways. If you're working with the teacher helps you create that bridge over it so you can go on to the next part. If you're doing it yourself, you have to take massive risks and break through what you normally do. If you're part of with your artist mates, you've got friends, ask advice, just say, I'm stuck on this bit here, what do you think I should do? So there are a few ways, and they never go away, those swollen rivers in the landscape. The space between them may get greater the better you get. When you first begin, you seem to be hitting one every 10 yards or whatever. But it's all about how you navigate and you break through those little things. So if you feel you're not improving, try something really radical. And that could be just, I think abstraction is a good way of doing it. So this is something I'll often do in my classes as well, is say, right, we're going to paint just abstract paintings today. So normally I'll start with like a horizon type thing, because I know, the horizon is important to me. But if I do an abstract, I'll do either a vertical or a slight diagonal line to start. So it's completely outside of that comfort zone.
Yeah.
And then just, build it up with a few lines, and then just start laying, colours in a loose geometric way. Because it's not what I do, but by breaking that spell of being stuck, you can find solutions in the alternative path. So coming back to ideas and theory and thought as well about it, I think it's really important that one is able to reflect on their work, whether it's through writing or again talking to other people about it. But I've got quite a solid philosophy now behind what I do. It is trying to capture this emotional response to a scene, a landscape. There's something not quite resolved about it. It's almost as if you were to see it for the first time, your eyes open for the first time, and you the details are devoid. So it's a very romantic tradition of painting. And again, I'm referencing Constable Turner, people like that. That's what I'm trying to capture. And I think once you understand what you're trying to capture as well, it can really, really help you.
Well, when you mentioned that you make abstract, this is not something that you publish, am I right? Because I don't think I've seen. No. Are you not happy enough with them, or is it just something which is
they're exercises mainly. Before I started painting landscapes, I did paint small abstract paintings. I was very inspired. I think abstract painting was probably the first painting that I actually loved. I was very into the abstract expressionists, particularly Rothko. I liked a lot because it was that sort of sublime kind of depth in it, a real kind of sadness, but overpowering kind of depth and emotion in there, and painterly as well. But I was also very into the St Ives painters as well, Peter Lanyon, and people like that, who were very much abstract landscape painters. So you had those two movements going on, abstract expressionism, and then in St Ives, Ben Nicholson, Patrick Heron, Peter Lanyon, and all of those guys. And that very Cornish, I could relate to that a lot more, whereas abstract expressionism was American, even though it was mainly Europeans that sort of pioneered it. But Richard Diebenkorn as well, massive influence. So yeah, I mainly started with abstract paintings, and a lot of it was experimental. I was doing these things, and I may to put in the video that you make, I may be able to dig one out from somewhere, but I used to kind of use unstretched, so unprimed raw canvas and pour like acrylic ink on it, but then place very flat, matte, kind of semi-geometric shapes over it. So you had this like bleed coming out of them. But composition was really important. And what I was trying to do is very much like I'm trying to do now is comment on that idea of, you know, both chaos and order, of structure, and then organic elements to it. It was only when I started to come out to see my family in Norfolk more from London. So my background is I grew up in the East Anglian Fens, very flat, just the horizon. That's all you're getting from the land, pretty much. And these kind of ditches and dikes, which kind of carve it up. But then these huge skies. I left to go travelling, spent most of my 20s travelling, but based myself down in Devon and Cornwall. Was there for about 10 years. And when I got into art down there, then ended up in London, was in London for about 12 years, and then finally moved here a couple of years ago. But what I was doing, I was painting these abstract paintings in London, and it was inspired by, you know, again, the St. Ives stuff, but also the abstract New York and California abstract expressionism. But I started to come out more to see my family in Norfolk, and to get here, I'd get the train, and it was through the fens that I'd grown up in, through Cambridgeshire, and you know, it's completely flat, but the sky started to have this impact on me again. And then when I would get to Norfolk, I would go to the beaches, and they would just be these incredible, like, vast spaces of drama. And I was starting to see them in an abstract way, thinking these are just the most basic of compositional frameworks. And then you've got all of this atmosphere and this kind of poetry within them. So I started to paint landscapes more. But unlike it being, I'm not a plein air painter, neither an observational. I would say I am an abstract painter still, but you know, I create these impressionistic elements in there from observation, but indirect observation.
Mm.
So yeah. It all links up that journey of you know, both past, present, but also artistic experimentation and development.
I can see the abstraction currently in your works. What I was going to say is that I can see that because it's so exciting in your work to keep it. I was thinking of it the other day when I think it's the last episode when we spoke to Kim Eshelman, and she loves your work just like, you know, all of our guests, and I do too. And when you look at your work, it's, you know, trying to find a flat, clear point where it's just pink, and there is tonal interest in that pink, and it's what makes everything so just juicy to kind of, for your eyes, you know, you're just really getting so much nourishment from it. It's lovely. And like she said, you've got this amazing sense of color where everything is, it just works beautifully together. So I can see how abstraction is part of it, because it's so non-specific in a way, but it's enough for everyone to inject their own personal experiences, feelings into it, which is magic.
And it's that fine line between it. I mean, you know, to abstract is to kind of take from something. And, you know, say with Rothko, for example, Rothko is all the way towards, you know, almost, you know, pure abstraction. That there isn't necessarily a source material there to abstract from. It's creative. And that is the development of abstraction in that sense. But one could say cubism to some extent was the beginning of breaking that all up, breaking up what you see, abstracting it. But all painting is abstract. It simply is. You are abstracting from reality or from study or whatever. But what happens is that development, comes through, and with abstract expressionism, but it really becomes about just the paint itself, the materiality of the paint, the the depth of colour, these kind of sort of things which are not representations of anything other than themselves to some extent. And the trajectory of that was it went off into different strands. So you had the Bay Area abstract expression, I think they're third generation, so Richard Diebenkorn and people like that, where they are representational painters, but they're also creating these abstractions as well that are, again, going back to the landscape and back to figurative work and stuff. But then you have these other strands which go off into minimalism, where a lot of the minimalists wanted to take any emotion, like Rothko's emotions, out of it and just push it towards these material things. And then to the point where you take in pretty much any human input out of it, into these things. So taking that back to what I do, again, it's that romantic tradition, and why, for example, I relate to Rothko. Howard Hodgkin, a British painter who died a few years ago, is also a massive influence as well. I don't know if you know him, but he's he painted very bold brushwork. They're not abstract, and he would never call them abstract. They are often still lifes or figurative work or landscapes. But he would kind of paint on the frame, but he would give them the most interesting names. He was friends with a lot of poets and writers, so but he was a massive influence as well, where you could create these paintings which which were very emotional and poetic and romantic, and you could push them even more towards abstraction or bring them more towards realism. But there was always that sort of liminal kind of area between the two. So for me, like, art history and the painting in general has always been a massive and important part of what I do, and I will always say to painters and to people I teach, learn about painting, not just how to do it, but the names of artists, so you can relate your work very much within a tradition, not as a selling point or to compare yourself to these artists, but be influenced by them. And again, people could look at my work and think, well, how is he influenced by Giorgio Morandi, for example, still life painter? It doesn't matter if your work doesn't look anything like it. These painters can teach you a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a couple of things. I was wondering about if you can, I don't know how briefly this would be, or whether I should have asked you this earlier, but I'm curious as where the painting from imagination, did that come from the abstraction, and therefore you didn't find that's where it originated? Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
see.
yeah. It came from the abstraction. I mean, I can paint from observation,
Yeah.
and often do, especially still life paintings. Um, but for me, it is. I mean, I've got a strange like memory. It's not photographic memory, but I can remember scenes that happen. A good example of this is during the lockdown when I was getting the train out of London a lot, and I was the only person on the train, and I would just get these glimpses. I remember like winter time, so the sun setting early, or I'm going out there early and seeing the sunrise. But just getting these glimpses out of the windows, the trains rushing by these landscapes, and I can picture them now. It's these like flashes you get, but they're not quite resolved. I mean, you won't be able to tell what tree that is, or do you know what I mean? It's that kind of thing. So I'm able to retain a lot of those things,
Mm.
um, boiled down to their essence. So even though I say I'm working from like imagination, imagination, it is a memory, but it is so abstracted,
Mm.
and that's what I'm trying to chase and trying to capture.
Yeah.
There's another element within it that is, I am a process painter as well. So, I may start with a painting that I think is going one way, but then it becomes something completely different. So for me, it's very much part of the process. So that's why, in a way, I'm not so much an observational painter, even though I can be and will sometimes paint plein air, or do observational sketches. But for me, if a painting, like if the cloud over there is not working there, I'll just shove it over here. Or if the horizon line is, just move it down. Or it will go from, a very moody, I don't have it here, but I've got a painting of a moon, just a little crescent moon. Now that started off as a seascape, and I was there for hours just messing around with it, getting so frustrated. And I thought I've had enough, so I just on the brush, it's like a violet, black, grey kind of colour, and I just thought, screw it, I'm going home, and I just covered the whole panel with it. It's like a 10 by 10. And then just as I turned around to look, I saw out of the corner of my eye out the studio window this dark sky, a cloud coming across, and then just a sliver of the moon. And in 5 minutes, what had taken me nearly 4 hours of absolute frustration and about to give up, in 5 minutes, I just went, mooning, done. And it's one of my favourite paintings. So that's what I mean about being like a process painter, that, I will resolve what happens, in what way it goes. Something I could have quite easily just walked away from that and not seen that moon, but I did in that moment. So I say I'm not an observational painter, but in that moment I was.
Mm.
You know,
It's very much
but
in the moment, which I love,
yeah,
whether it's the
yeah,
process or a glimpse of an obscured
yeah,
reflection or kind of bit of
yeah,
light. That's really powerful as well, to be
yeah.
able to inject that where you need it, as opposed to the world dictating to you what's necessary.
That's
You
right.
can
Yeah,
grab things and change them at your will, which is,
yeah,
I think, more creative in a way. Not to give a more or less, that may not be true, but
no,
I feel there's a freedom there which other artists don't necessarily have. I certainly struggle at times. And Gino Santamaria is one of our guests who said that his friend put his hand on his shoulder and said, I give you permission to move these equilateral
That's it.
trees,
Yeah,
move them, give them, more
yeah,
distance in places,
yeah,
and
yeah,
groups them together.
yeah. I think it's very true. And even, observational painters have to rely on memory to some extent. I mean, you can't look at something and paint at the same. You have to look, and then you make the brushstroke. You look. So yeah, the memory is a shorter amount of time, but there's still that there. But you
Mm.
also have to rely on, that intuition of shifting things, of shifting tones.
Mm.
I think one thing where and I'm not far from having any rules in painting. I mean, I'm an anarchist when it comes to painting. However you want to do it. But there is one thing I see a lot, and that is because it's from my own experience, but also because I meet a lot of people who come to my workshops or classes because they've got this issue, and that is copying from photographs. It is very, very hard, and one is always, always disappointed. If you haven't learned the sort of painterly skills from risk taking, from um, direct observation, or painting from memory or imagination, when it comes to then painting for photographs, what you're going to do, you're going to try and copy one medium in that sense. Photography is a medium, and you're going to try and render that with basically mud in oil and these crude sticks. It is very, very difficult to do. And so many people who I've taught have come from doing that, and they're always frustrated because they try to do these little details. So what I do is say, here's a photo, look at it for a few minutes. You can't look at it anymore, remember it. I think I'm much better at being able to work from photographs now myself if I need to, but so much is lost because you're comparing your painting, your work of art, to something which is almost as close to perfect as a way of capturing something. Let painting be its own thing, and I think this is what Impressionism teaches us. That at the time of Impressionism, and maybe my timelines are out a little bit here, but they're pretty close. That photography started to become much more available and portable as well. So you could depict a landscape, and it was usually wealthy landowners that wanted that depiction of their landscape. You could depict it almost perfectly, albeit in black and white, with a camera.
Mm.
There's been this thing in painting, in the history of art for centuries. It's like the death of painting. It's this kind of meme that goes throughout it. Photography did prove an existential threat to certain elements of painting, but Impressionism really created painting for painting's sake. That paint is its own medium and its own language, and is in many ways much more versatile and open to individual expression than photography. And you see this kind of happening a lot. And I think if we look now with the rise of plein air painting, again, it's a sort of a revival of it in the past decade or so. There's a kind of a parallel there with smartphones. Now, what's interesting as well is that the plein air painters through Instagram, through whatever, are able to also utilize those smartphones. But we've had it a lot where digital photography as well was a kind of the death of painting again. Now AI and all of that stuff, you see this debate, it's like, well, AI will kill painting. But, painting is and will always be like this, this thing that we're fascinated by. It is so primal, from Lascaux cave art to now, that it is a kind of a thing that, yes, technology always threatens it, but it always manifests in its own way. And it's fascinating. I went off on a tangent there, but
No, it's all right. I think we're butting up against time. I mean, I agree. I was going to say vinyl has come back into fashion, and it's far more expensive than it used to be. So sure, if we have that kind of arc with painting in AI, it will come back and just. So yeah, that is something which AI, I haven't seen it yield the results yet, which, I mean, obviously I'm fascinated by what it does do, but I don't see it necessarily being the threat it's being described as yet. It may happen, and if it does happen, I'm sure that it will be the CD to vinyl or the digital file to what vinyl is, where people want that experience of vinyl again, which you can't get with a digital file.
Well, I would compare it more in a way to, on the music thing, that you didn't have these individual musicians anymore that would create, these kind of, tortured but beautiful songs. You wouldn't have these kind of shambolic bands that, were chaotic and dysfunctional to some extent. AI would create the perfect music, and you wouldn't need bands or even musicians anymore, because it would do it. But people would always want that kind of experience, and I think that it would only give rise to a kind of revival of punk or something like that would actually take it back to its kind of raw roots. And maybe that's initially how punk may have come about, because I know you had a lot of like prog rock, and things were becoming much more digital, and synthesizers, and a lot more polished, and punk was that thing. It's like, just give that guy a bass guitar, he can't play, it doesn't matter, it's about that energy. And I think painting, in a way, very much like Impressionism, was both an embracing of the technology, i.e. paint tubes. The Impressionists could go out and paint. The trains around France were starting to make it so painters could leave the city and go out to the countryside. There's a great painting by Gustave Courbet, and he's not an Impressionist, pre-Impressionist. I think it's called the Barbizon School. But great painter of the sea, Courbet. He lived in Paris, I think. But then they had this train that suddenly started going to the coast, and there's a painting of this lovely seascape with this little guy like standing on the beach with his hat in the air. So, because he's got that freedom, he's embraced the technology of the time to do that. But I think also that Impressionism was a revolt against both the old order, the salon, and then some of that new order of the technological advances with photography and things like that. So whenever I see like AI art and stuff like that, I mean, it's just like is that all you've got? Yeah, it's kind of clever, but where are those brush hairs in the final painting? You know, where is that history of this making on the surface? And I think that's a massive important thing for me, is to show the history of the painting on its surface. You know, if you kind of look, you can see where I've got frustrated and come to that river I need to cross, and then, you know, maybe gone off and stomped around the block a bit, got frustrated, found that solution. You know, AI will never do that.
Yeah. Plus, I think it was it Erin Spencer who said that it's part of the legacy of painting. You know, for her, it's her connection with the UK and her European roots, which she really taps into to give this quality to her painting. And if you have generations and generations of AI, it'll surely be lending from those experiences, because without it, you don't have story and you won't have any kind of roots to tap into. So it'll only be pulling from the experience of the analog in order to make something.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And look, I mean, artists are, you know, their art is a kind of, you know, it's their whole experience is put into those things. And like with Erin, and I mean, that's how I first connected with Erin. She was actually, you know, sort of painting in the area I grew up, and so she was American, and, you know, so then there's that bond and that connection there, that I recognize these guys and then can see it in her work there in, you know, on Rhode Island or Utah. We all have these different threads and strands to who we are as painters, and I think this is why it makes it so fascinating and unique. But also with the viewer as well. I mean, you know, they're just seeing how my work connects with certain people in a very profound way, whereas, you know, for a lot of people it doesn't, and that's fine, you know. But there's some crossover between artists, you know, that, you know, some people like really can tune in to, you know, say my work and Erin's work, and is a parallel. You know, it's such an interesting thing that taste and experience and aesthetics, and but also knowing a bit about the artist, that, you know, the artist isn't just this, you know, just this person that people are kind of fascinated about them in many ways, because they're often living very different lives to how many people live. You know, I feel very fortunate and grateful to make all of my money off either selling paintings or teaching painting. You know, I mean, it's a crazy thing. I mean, I've done every job you can think of, every minimum wage job you can think of. You know, to be able to get to this point of doing it took a lot of, you know, risk-taking things. So it, you know, it creates an interesting story, and that can often be seen in the work as well. And so going back to AI, you know, it's nothing really.
It's just a different place, isn't it? It's just not,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to overlap that much with what we're talking about a lot. And I feel like people, though, will say there's no place where it won't penetrate and take over. But I can't, until I see it, I can't see it. I just can't even visualize it. I mean, not to keep bringing, I mean, I like keep bringing up people who we've had as guests, but not to keep referring to them. But it made me think of Tad Retz had an interesting overlap, because he'd used digital tools in order to develop certain things and make decisions. And that's what my brother does. And because his brother works in animation, I found it quite an interesting personality to kind of consider as an artist. Because as you said, they're not a monolith. They're all,
yeah,
plowing their own furrow, really. So it's to see how Tad was very driven and had craftsmanship with his dad's making the is it attaché case that he was making?
Pashard box,
A
yeah.
shard box, sorry, yeah, that's it. And it's yeah, to have this kind of creative but very kind of old-fashioned roots behind his work practice, and yet his modern and youthful approach to considerations and different ways that he develop his painting, and his discipline of going out and painting all the time to try and mature his palette and his
Uh,
appreciation for the world was just a lovely experience. And it opened my eyes again to the different ways that people find what makes sense and how they're going to be who they are.
Absolutely. And that's, again, it goes back to that thing of experiment, experiment, experiment.
Mm.
If one is going to go to, courses or life drawing classes or whatever it is, go to different ones, try different things. Go to one where they say, you've got to do it with your eyes closed or something like that.
Yeah.
Because it's through that. And with Tad, it's fascinating because he's so young still. But he said he went out west and he just painted plein air
Mm.
until he got good at it. And using Photoshop and things like that, that is, that comes from that saying, I'm going to try that. And there are no rules. And I think it was interesting listening to your episode last time with Andrew Tischler, saying, about these people that say, oh, he used a projector. It's, this is the kind of thing that I think keeps, people stuck in many ways. Now, there are people who are uber talented, absolutely amazing, and can do things, like it's dropped, it's part of their DNA. But that is very, very rare. I know someone who is talented like that, but it is extremely, extremely rare. Most artists try different things and different approaches. They destroy lots of canvases. They try many, many different things. And, that could be projecting, could be Photoshop. It could, in the future, be AI. In my quest to learn more about colour, and I don't know if it done me any good in the end because it was just a computer doing it. There were a couple of, I guess they were some form of kind of AI in their own way. But there was a website called Central Logic and another one on the golden acrylic paint website, where what you could do, and I'll use the Central Logic one as an example, you could go and you could either buy or use the free ones, where they give you like a palette of colours, say Winsor and Newton oil, artist oil colours, and you could pick ultramarine blue, and I'll use my colour palette, my basic palette, ultramarine blue, rose madder, cadmium yellow, burnt sienna, white, and you click those. And then you could upload a photograph in there and you could use a little thing to tap on certain areas of the photograph. And what it would do, it would show you 30% ultramarine blue, 10% rose madder, and all of that. And I spent about a year to measure these things out to try and get them right. Now, it didn't teach me how to mix paint, but I had to go through that process. And I remember, after a while, you had to start buying, things. So I'd sort of just get all of these credits to do it. But I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn. So I used that technology to learn. And, if anything, it visually showed me the tone could be made out of those. there's all kinds of stuff, whether it's projecting or even tracing. I remember at one point I really got into, this was 15 years ago or something, but I got into this like image transfer by using a photocopy, and then basically using clear acrylic medium on a surface, putting the photocopy on there, letting it dry, and then using a damp cloth on the back to rub away the paper, and it transferred. And I would kind of make paintings out of that, these weird like abstract textures and figurative elements. And I went through a stage of doing that, went through so many stages of getting like trying to make this sort of almost clay type stuff to stick on the canvas to put textures. If you just go in and you go into a class and you do the same thing every week and not getting anywhere, go and do something crazy. Try something different.
I find myself going more old-fashioned. I mean, next year I already have a trip planned with one of the farmers who I painted from my recent project, and we're going to a place called Paris Mountain on Anglesey, and that's a place which is a copper mine, and it has natural pigments, which is very rich. And I've met an artist who she collected them in little sacks, grinds them up with a pestle and mortar, and then uses them with egg tempera. And I've done egg tempera once, so I know I can do it, and I'm excited to get natural pigments and to maybe even paint something from Paris Mountain, because it looks like something from a science fiction film, so it's an exciting prospect for next year. One thing I'd like to say before we do run out of time there, a couple of episodes ago, we've already discussed, I had Ralph Sanders and Finner Park Gallery, and one of the mistakes I made, and I try to avoid this if I can, I mislabeled one of the paintings, and it was an important painting. He was talking about a significant
the price.
No, it wasn't that. No, that was
just, you mislabeled it in the thing. Yeah,
I mislabeled the actual name of the painting, which is important because the Cuffin Williams is just hilarious. Not only the price being wrong, the fact that it wasn't even hung on the wall; it was on the floor when I saw it. But he does still have Cuffin Williams drawings in the gallery that are £5,000. So I could conceive of it being hundreds of thousands. I don't know how much it was, but it must have been, because it was a large painting. I'm very curious as how much it was now, because I misread that price tag. Anyway, the painting which I made a mistake on, I'd like to correct now and amend and show the pictures. I called a painting which he was talking about by Kevin Sinnott was Running Away with the Hairdresser. Yeah. This is that picture. The picture which I showed was one which he owned, which is by Kevin Sinnott, and I think he told me it was called Echoes, but it was labeled as Running Away with the Hairdresser, which is a different painting that I have seen in person, ironically or coincidentally at Cuffin Williams, an art gallery with a Cuffin Williams statue outside. I think it's a Cuffin Williams gallery on Anglesey, and I'd seen that painting, Kevin Sinnott's painting, and photographed it with my German friend who I worked with this year. And her and I were looking around discussing the paintings. It was just the two of us in this exhibition space. And I saw this Kevin Sinnott painting and said to her how much I loved how impressionistic it was and how much you can see the environment and the story, even though it's very loose and just, not significant detail in there. And I'd photographed the piece and then made the mistake when I talked to Ralph. So that was tricky because I knew there wasn't a way of fixing the video after the fact on YouTube. And I didn't do it on the Andrew Tischler part 2. I didn't do it on Kim Eshelman, which was last week's episode. So for this week's episode, the Christmas, I'm at least saying this correction.
Look, these things are bound to happen. It's
I try to avoid it if I can.
So what time is it? So it's been fantastic talking, because during the podcast most people haven't heard Simon and I do. We often have little meetings and chat, but it's great because we're both so passionate about art and about these things and about learning, and you know, we could actually keep talking probably for
It's
another few,
easily,
um,
yeah,
but we won't, and we'll
no,
leave it. You know, I think maybe for the podcast in the future, it would be great if we could get like maybe a few guests on at once, and we have these more sort of relaxed and casual type things, because it's good, like people bouncing idea and just letting the conversations go where they may.
yeah, yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm excited to see what happens. The panel that we're working on is an exciting target for next year. So,
Yeah, yeah. So we've probably won't announce it just now, just just in case. But we've got an interesting panel coming up. But if anybody has any suggestions for us, kind of shows you'd like or information you'd like, whether you'd like us to talk about historic artists. I mean, there is, an element there. I mean, there's all kinds of, academics and stuff who study particular artists and could tell us more if that's something, or, whether it's more about, elements around it, sometimes the business side of art. What, how do I make money out of it? How do other people do it? Or if it is more around, those kind of more philosophical elements as well. How do you sort of build that philosophy around your art and grow from there? Because I think it's very important that you have something. If you're inspired by something, you are going to make much better art.
absolutely.
It's as simple as that.
Well, thank you very much to everyone who has commented and viewed the podcast. It's fantastic. And as always, I really appreciate you, Richard, and, sharing your experience and your work is always a pleasure. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Simon, as well. I mean, it's been a great journey so far, and I look forward to the next part of it. And I'll say as well to anybody listening or watching, do like and subscribe. Now I sound like a proper YouTuber. Do like and subscribe. If you were listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anything like that, do try and give us a rating because it helps. I think we're quite fortunate because we're in a very niche thing, and there aren't that many painting podcasts out there. And the fact that we've got painting in our title, if you Google painting, if you search painting in Apple Podcasts, it actually comes up. However, like ratings, leave a review, give us 5 stars or whatever. It all helps. And when we're on Patreon, we'd really appreciate your support, even if it's like enough for a cup of coffee a month or a pint.
Yeah, it all helps. But fantastic. Lovely talking to you, Richard.
Yeah, you too, Simon.